Tonight we'll study Parshas Chayei Sara. We covered most of what I wanted to speak about last year, but it's still left. And I would like to also, at some point, talk to you a little bit about the relationship between Avram and Yitzchak and Rivka, and of course, Avram and Sara. So what I want to do is announce the psukim. So if you have a chumash, you'll be able to see it inside. And we'll begin with a pasuk that I think will help us sort of move into Parshas Chayei Sara at the end of Parshas Vayera. So we're looking now to start ourselves off for tonight with a discussion. Let me just find it, I'm sorry. At the very end of Parshas Vayera, this is Perek Chaf Beis, Pasuk Yud Tes. Chaf Beis, Yud Tes. Vayashav Avraham el Ni'arav, Vayakumu vayelchu yachdav el Beersheva, Vayeshev Avram beBeersheva. I have a particular approach that I wanted to share with you, and it's a little bit different than what's normally understood. See, in the parsha, at the end of Vayera, twice the Torah says, Vayelchu shneim yachdav, that Avram and Yitzchak went together. But this particular pasuk that I want to call your attention to gives a slightly different impression, because it sounds like Avram went back to his HaRav, his young man, to Eliezer and to Ishmael. And now, Vayakumu Vayelchu Yachdav. It's not the same Vayelchu Yachdav that we saw twice in this very parsha, in which Avram and Yitzchak were going together. In fact, the Torah almost seems to emphasize Vayeshev Avram beBeersheva, and Avram settled in Beersheva. Where's Yitzchak? Why doesn't the Torah indicate that Yitzchak settled in Beersheva? And in fact, we can derive the conclusion that Yitzchak didn't go back to Beersheva. We don't know exactly where he went to, but he went on his own way. So Avram returns to his Ni'arim, goes to Beersheva, and Yitzchak goes on his own way. And that stands in dire contrast to what we saw earlier in this very same section about Vayelchu Shneim Yachdav. But what's the difference between the two? And the answer is the Akedah. What happens as a result of the Akedah? The Akedah represents a kind of a new covenant, a new bris between the people of Israel and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Of course, the people of Israel here are represented by Avram and Yitzchak. The Akedah, in a sense, upgrades the entire covenantal community and covenantal relationship that we spoke about last time to new levels. As a result of this new covenant, Avram goes his way and Yitzchak his. Avram represents the attribute of chesed, of kindness, outgoing, benevolent. Avram has myriads of students, of disciples, hanefesh asher asu b'charan. He has a wide impact, uplifting, as it were, with him masses of people. Yitzchak represents the exact opposite. He represents withdrawal, very much into himself. He represents sacrifice. After all, it was Yitzchak who was meant to be sacrificed, and according to the Medrash, he was sacrificed to some extent at the Akedah. Yitzchak is the epitome of the midah of Gvura. Gvura, otherwise known as Din, judgment, is antithetical to the midah of Chesed. So Avram and Yitzchak now are propelled forward after the Akedah with a new bris relationship in which Avram is going to personify the midah of Chesed and Rachamim, and Yitzchak, on the other hand, the midah of Gvura and Din. And in that sense, the Akedah was not replaced by harmony between father and son, but father and son now come away from the Akedah experience, each one, so to speak, in a world of his own. Avram in his world of Chesed, Yitzchak in his world of Din. Avram Avinu returns to Beersheba. Beersheba now becomes the center of Avram's dissemination of Torah. But Yitzchak doesn't have a role as a personification of the midah of Gvura in disseminating Torah on a broad basis. And therefore, the Torah tells us, if not explicitly by implication, that Yitzchak did not return to that center of Avram teaching and spreading his wings and propagating the Torah in Beersheba. Later on, either tonight or a different occasion, we're going to discuss the Be'eros, the wells of Avram Avinu. The Plishtim, as you know, closed these wells. They put Ofar into it, and it's only going to be in the next generation of Yitzchak that Yitzchak is going to redig the wells of Avram after the terrible actions of our enemies, of the Plishtim. And it could be that at that point, Yitzchak is going to shift in a way that he utilizes his midah of Din, and it's going to integrate with the midah of Avram Avinu to create a whole new generation, which in the third generation will be personified by Yaakov as Tif'eres, as an integration of both the Chesed of Avram and the Gvura, the Din of Yitzchak. But we'll get to that on a different occasion. What is the end of the Akedah? You and I would have said that Vayoshev Avram el Beersheba, that's the end of the occasion, finito. But no, there's an entire section here that's made up of 5 psukim, a whole unit of the parsha that tells us about Nachar, Avram's brother, who is an idol worshiper, and how he propagates and has many children. And if you count the number of children here, it's amazing. Nachar has 8 children with Milcah, and then he has a Pelegish by the name of Reuma, and he has another 4 children with her. All told, 12 children. Avram Avinu with Sara has 1 child. With Hagar, he has Ishmael, etc., etc. And one wonders, why is this section placed here immediately following the Akedah? In fact, it's what's called a Parsha Psucha, which means that the Parsha of the Akedah opens up and spills into this section. You know, it's hard to even read the names here. Utz and Buz and Kruel, Pidlash, Pildash, and Yidla. I mean, you break your teeth. Why does the Torah place this Parsha right here, almost indicating that this is the end of the Akedah, and we're ready for Chayei Sara. Rashi says, Kidei liyaches is Rivka. This entire section here really belongs to the next parsha. It doesn't belong here in Vayera. It belongs to the parsha of the Shidduch of Yitzchak in Chayei Sara. But I find this Rashi very difficult. I would look for an alternative. I'll tell you why. On Rosh Hashanah, we read the parsha of the Akedah. And guess what? We don't end the reading of the parsha with Vayashav Avram el Beersheva, but we attach the next series, the unit of 5 psukim, at the end of the Kriya of Rosh Hashanah. The purpose of reading Akedas Yitzchak is Kedei Sheyala Zichronenu B'Yom Hadin, on the great day of judgment of Rosh Hashanah. Why is this section added? And in fact, I worked it out mathematically. You know, we have 5 kruim on Rosh Hashanah. We could have easily had 5 kruim by dividing up the Akedah into the number of psukim that we need with all the rules and so forth and so on. We didn't need to add this parasha at all. And it's like a sore thumb. I believe that this parasha is part of the Akedah, and perhaps even the greatest challenge in the Akedah itself. Let me give you an example to sort of introduce my concept. During World War II, Switzerland was, quote unquote, neutral. I'm not going to go into detail about how many Jews in Switzerland who escaped the Nazis and got into Switzerland and were sent back to their deaths in Germany and other countries. I'm not getting into that. You know, I assume that amongst the Swiss, maybe there were good goyim and not so good goyim. But be that as it may, Switzerland, as you know, is one of the wealthiest countries on the face of the earth. And they were neutral. If you take a look at Switzerland and you compare Switzerland to the situation, the pathetic situation of the Jewish people during the war, the Swiss were neutral, standing on the back, you know, watching from a distance, and they prosper. They continue to expand financially and so forth and so on. This, I believe, al derech hamashal, is the challenge that Avraham Avinu faces after the Akedah. I can imagine that there's a local newspaper, we call it a rag, and on the front cover of the newspaper, it tells you about the births of all these children and grandchildren of Nachar. Who is Nachar? He is an idol worshiper. We don't know a single good thing about him, other than the fact that he's Avram's brother. Avram comes down from the Akedah. He's got one son with Sara Imenu, and this son has to go through, endure the trials and tribulations of an Akedah. And what goes on with the idol worshippers? Look at them. They're living off the fat of the land. No one is bothering them. They're not losing any sleep at night. Why does Avraham Avinu, the man of Emunah, who's dedicated to propagating the teachings of God, why does he have to suffer? His wife is an Akara. They have one child finally, and that child has to go up on the Akedah. And Avram says nothing. The Emunah, the silence, the dedication of Avram, in this particular context, I believe, exceeds beyond the Nisayon, the trial of the Akedah itself. That Avram Avinu could possibly see what's going on. People living so comfortably, such an easy life, riding the waves. And he is destined to so much suffering, to so many challenges. And Avram accepts it all. We'll see this later on in Mitzvah Hashem when we get to Parshas Shmini, and we're going to talk there about the dedication of the Mikdash. Aaron loses two sons, Nadav Avihu, on that very day of jubilation. Vayidom Aaron, the silence of Aaron. It's something that goes beyond our comprehension. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Aderes. The Aderes was a great Lithuanian scholar approximately 90 years ago, and he lost his daughter now. Terrible tragedy. When he came to the funeral of his own daughter, he was nowhere to be found. Apparently, he had locked himself up in a room, and he didn't come out for 2 hours. Finally came out, and he recited Baruch Dayana Emes, and he cut Kriya. And one of his students, I don't know who had the chutzpah to ask him, Rebbe, what happened? Where were you? And he said that the halacha is kishem shemevarchim al hatova kach mevarchim al hara. And Rashi indicates in Masechta Brachos that we have to have the same feeling as we do al hatova al hara. I couldn't get myself to recite that bracha the way we're obligated to do so. It took me hours to reach that level. This is the challenge of a person who dedicates his whole life, every ounce of energy, to the Torah of Hashem, suffering such tragedy, and yet accepting it bi'ava. It's a madrega beyond our comprehension. I think I've mentioned to you in the past a book by the name of Mima Makin. It was authored by Rav Meisels. He was the unofficial Rav of Auschwitz. Of course, the Nazis, Yamach Shema, they didn't know that he was who he was. Everything was done underground. In the year 1942, he was asked the following shaila, which he wrote up after the war. He miraculously survived the war in a Sefer Tshuvas called Mima Makin. And in my humble opinion, the tshuva that I'm about to present to you is the most profound of the entire Sefer. He tells the following story. On that Rosh Hashanah, the Nazis required of the capo to gather together 1,400 children to be murdered on Rosh Hashanah. 1942 is not that long ago. We're not talking about a story that took place thousands of years ago. And Rav Meisels tells us that he had the following shaila. A father of one of those 1,400 children that was rounded up by the capo asked him in this language, he says, I was able to smuggle from my shtetl, when they gathered us together, an expensive piece of jewelry, a very small but expensive diamond. And I know that I could bribe the capo and save my son, knowing full well that they'll have to reach the quota of 1,400, another child will be taken to replace my child. Am I permitted to do so? And Rav Meisels records that he answered him, it would take a Sanhedrin Agadola of 71 elders to answer your question. And here I am, pathetic in Auschwitz. You expect me to be able to answer the question. And the father kept asking him and pushing him. And Rav Meisels kept avoiding him. He says, I can't give you an answer. And the father understood that to save yourself or your son in this case at the expense of another life is not necessarily permitted. And on that Rosh Hashanah, when his son went on to the Akedah, the father turns to the Ribono Shel Olam and he says, my sacrifice is greater than that of Avraham Avinu. My Akedah, Avraham Avinu never went full swing. And at the end, Yitzchak was not taken on the Akedah. My son is murdered by these beasts that look like human beings. Imagine what a Jew is capable of doing. Sara finds out about the Akedah, and at this point, the Torah records that she died. I discussed at great length last year, I don't want to repeat myself, the very verbose language in the first pasuk here, Chayei Sara, Mea Shana, Esrim Shana, Sheva Shanim, Shnei Chayei Sara, and Rashi points out, Kulam Shaveh Litova. At the age of 100, she was like a 20-year-old. At the age of 20, she was like a 7-year-old. And I gave you my interpretation. I'd like to tonight point out a few things about this opening parsha in Chayei Sara. First of all, we should keep in mind that Avram Avinu, seeking a burial plot for his wife, Sara, gravitates to Kiryat Arba hi Chevron b'Eretz Canaan. Notice that according to Chazal, this was not the first occasion in which Avram had discovered this place, Kiryat Arba. In fact, at the time of the Archim, the three angels that visited Avram at the beginning of Parshas Vayera, Chazal and the Medrash tell us that Avram Avinu was running after a goat or a sheep in order to slaughter it to feed the Archim, and the sheep ran all the way to Kiryas Arba. Why is it that if Avram Avinu already had an encounter, a connection to Kiryas Arba, he did nothing about that until the death of his wife Sara? Now let's calculate. The Malachim visit Avram a year before Yitzchak is born. Sara dies when Yitzchak comes down from the Akedah. Chazal tell us Yitzchak was 37 years old. 38 years have gone by until Avram Avinu purchases the Ba'aras HaMachpelah Kiryas Arba. Why is that so? And Chazal tell us that Kiryas Arba is the opening, the Pesach to all of Eretz Canaan. And when Avram Avinu purchases the land of Eretz Canaan, he really purchases for the sake of his descendants all of Eretz Canaan through that one Pesach. Why wait 38 years? I would like to suggest the following possibility. Avram Avinu is a very unique integration of two personality traits. One I call passive, accepting, never questioning, and the other proactive. in the episode of the Malachim, of the kings, Avram sees that his nephew Lot was taken captive, and he is proactive to the point in which we don't even understand, as we say in Talmudic language, what was the Havamim? What was he thinking that he could win this battle with a battalion made of 318 soldiers, which according to one Bea in the Gemara Nedarim, 318 is the Gematria of Eliezer, one soldier. But Avram Avinu cannot tolerate the situation as it is, and he goes out there to fight this battle. On the other hand, we see that Avram Avinu, if I could use a term, an idiomatic phrase in American English, he goes with the punches. He flows with the water. He doesn't make a big to-do about anything. He comes to Eretz Canaan because God told him to go. Lech lecha. He arrives and there's a famine, and he knows he's got to find a place which has food to eat, and he leaves Eretz Canaan. And every single occasion, he just accepts the will of God and flows with the punches. Avram Avinu is what we call hamtana. Are you familiar with that word? Again, it's not an attribute that's very common amongst Israelis. Hamtana means patience, savlanut, waiting for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to guide him and to reveal to him when is the time ripe. I need an occasion to establish my ownership, my property rights, and an acquisition on Eretz Yisrael, on Eretz Canaan. This is going to be the occasion. The death of Sara propels Avram to a tragic situation in which he has to find a burial plot. And he goes to Ephron. Ephron, based on Hasidic thought in Jewish mysticism, represents Ophar. Ephron be Lashon Ophar, takes you down. Avram Avinu is dedicated to inspiring us and take us up. There's going to be a conflict here. And what's really at stake is all of our emunah, our faith, because Eretz Canaan is at stake over here. And Ephron is only interested in selling Kiryat Arba because of the great temptation of making a financial killing. Sometimes I think that maybe Avram Avinu did not want to seek out Ephron 38 years earlier, because then Ephron would have doubled the price. Because whenever you're desperate to buy something, if I call you up and I say, oh, is your apartment for sale because my wife fell in love with your apartment, they're going to double the price on it. So Avram Avinu hides it. Look, my wife died, and now I have to find a burial plot. And what is Kiryat Arba? Rashi quotes a medrash here. And Hebron was called Kiryat Arba because of the four zugos, the four pairs that are buried in that cemetery. Adam and Chava, and the patriarchs and the matriarchs, the Avos and the Imos. There's a fascinating concept here. Adam and Chava are not part of the covenantal community. They belong to the human race. They represent mankind as a whole. And yet, they are buried together with the Avos and the Imos, the covenantal community. And this, I believe, is a merger of two communities that unite to form one community of the whole, that encompasses the whole of the human race. The human community is going to face challenges, many challenges. And of course, the covenantal community, as we said at the outset, is going to face so many challenges. The human community will face problems like famine, disease. When you talk about disease, I don't have to tell you, I don't have to give you a list of diseases because we all have one disease on the tip of our tongue. War, oppression, and a host of different moral issues and challenges, atheism, permissiveness, and then you can talk about the environment, pollution of the environment, and a host of different challenges that the human community faces. The covenantal community has its very unique problems and challenges. But we have to realize that to the same extent that the human race as a whole faces all its challenges, we, the covenantal community, are part of that community. We're all the offspring of not only the Avos and the Imos, but of Adam and Chava. A Jew cannot hide himself and run away from his responsibilities vis-a-vis the general community. When the Torah describes in Bereshis the creation of man, God turns to man and he says, "Redu b'tgas hayam," etc., etc. Kivshua. Kivshua means to conquer and overcome all the difficulties and all the challenges. The Jew is called upon to contribute to the general welfare of the entire community. It is the responsibility of the Jew, because when God says v'kivshua, to face all these challenges, he is addressing equally non-Jew and Jew alike. And as human beings, the Jew is called upon to contribute to the general welfare of the Gentile society as well. And we share together with the Gentiles some sort of universal, we'll call it historical experience. And we are duty bound to do our utmost to contribute constructively with great energies to the general welfare of mankind. But let me focus your attention for a moment on Avram's personal response to the tragic loss of his wife. The pasuk says here, and this is the second verse in Perek Chav Gimel, opening Chayei Sara, "Vatomas Sara b'kiryas Arba hi Chevron b'Eretz Canaan, vayavo Avram lispod l'Sara v'livkosa." To eulogize Sarah and to cry. What's the difference between these two words, lispod and livkos? And I find this pasuk very strange, because first you break out almost spontaneously in crying in bechi, and then you regain your ability to make a judgment, to evaluate the situation. That's called hesped. And the natural sequence here should have been bechi and then hesped, and yet lispod l'Sara v'livkosa. You would think that after all of the experiences in the long marriage between Avram and Sara, all the challenges they faced together, all the adventures, all of their praying together and their suffering together, their striving to reach God, faith, and propagate. Our Avram opens up his oil and Sarah opens up her oil. After all this together, we would expect Avram to cry out. They had spent an entire lifetime as two lives merged as one, experiencing, as it were, all of the challenges, all of the common experiences. And shouldn't we expect that Avram would cry when his beloved wife, Sara, was snatched away from him, taken from his Ohel? The Ohel of Avram without Sara is an empty Ohel. And we could only imagine that this tragedy for Avram was unbearable. In fact, subsequent to the death of Sara, we find nothing about Avram Avinu, except for the fact that he sent Eliezer in this week's parsha to find a marriage partner for Yitzchak. But in that sense, Avram is not playing a major role. Avram without Sara is not another nidach, another level in the covenantal community. As far as Avram's contribution to the covenantal community, it ends at the beginning of Chayei Sara with the death of his wife. So Sara is not just a beloved mate. She is a partner to Avram, a comrade. They face together all of the challenges to create a new moral code that was predicated and based on emunah, on monotheistic faith in one God. And now she's gone. Why does Avram's grief express itself not as bechi, but rather as hesped? Why is it that Avram mourns the death of his wife under hesped rather than bechi? And I believe that the answer lies in the twofold relationship between husband and wife. On the one hand, she is beloved, his beloved wife, the shared experiences, the connection. V'hoyu l'basar echad is Avram and Sara. But on the other hand, she is his partner, his comrade in their life's goal and agenda and contribution. She is no less than Avram, the propagator of the Masorah, the teachings, the transmission. She is the mother of the Masorah, if he is the father of the Masorah. And the Torah wants to tell us, by placing Lispod, Hesped first, is that Avram Avinu, as a response to the death of Sara, collected his thoughts, something that you and I would find almost humanly impossible. And he evaluated, assessed the loss of Sara in a hesped mode to realize that the contribution to the Masorah of that first generation has come to an end. That's the hesped. Immediately in the aftermath of the hesped, Avram Avinu is overcome hysterically by the emotional response. He's able to first hesped control and, so to speak, subjugate his emotional response. And then the floodgates are open and it's pure bechi, hysteria. I'm reminded of a story that I heard about the altar of Slobodka. I heard it about others as well. Gedolei Yisrael, who found out on Yontif the terrible news of a loss of a beloved member of the family. Avelus, in such a case, is postponed until after Yom. The mitzvah of V'samachta b'chagecha, the Gemara establishes, among cotton trumps the mitzvah of Avelis. And these Gedolei Yisrael were able to control their emotions, continue, involve themselves in the V'samachta b'chagecha until after Havdalah is recited, and then all of grief, all of Bechi, hysterical crying now floods them. Such control of the mind over the heart, such discipline. You know that I wrote an essay called Halachic Man. And in that essay, I told the story about my maternal grandfather. And I got quite a bit of criticism about that story. Maybe I shouldn't have published it. My grandfather, his name was Rabbi Elia Feinstein, Rabbi Elia Pruzhinen, my mother Pesha's father. He was in a situation where his daughter, his beloved daughter, was fading away in a hospital. And it was almost daybreak. And he asked the doctor, how long does she have to live? The doctor estimated a half hour. And Rebellia left his daughter's bedside, quickly wrapped himself in tefillin, in talis, recited Kriyat Shema, and then immediately took off his tefillin, returned to the bedside of his daughter, who then expired. Imagine the mind power of an ish halacha, knowing full well that after she expires, he's an onain, and he cannot fulfill the mitzvahs of tefillin, of Kabbalah Sol Malchus Shamayim, and he's able to rip himself away from the bedside to fulfill these mitzvahs. This is Hesped before Bech. I'd like to fast forward for a moment to Pasuk Yud Zayin. Verse 17 here in this chapter, it opens up Chayei, chapter 23, Chav Gimel. Vayakom stay Ephron asher b'machpelah, asher lifnei Mamre. And then fast forward to Pasuk Chav. Vayakom hasodav ha'ma'or asher boli Avram lachuzas kover me'es b'nei ches. Notice, please, the repetition. In both cases, Pasuk Yud Zayin, Pasuk Chaf, Vayakom stay Ephron. And perhaps the only difference is that in Pasuk Chaf, the Torah introduces a new concept called Achuzas Kever. I'll read to you the English translation. And the field and the cave within it were established to Avram as burial property, purchased from the sons of Ches. Why does the Torah have to repeat itself? We already have learned that Avram Avinu buried his wife Sara in Maras HaMachpelah. We have already studied the fact that Avram paid 400 shekel over La Socher in Pasuk Zayin. And Stei Ephron in Pasuk Yud Zayin is described as a cave in a field. The field has trees, and they become a burial plot. Avram had paid for it, as we said before. Why is it necessary to repeat that this property is an achuzas cover? Achuzas cover means it's part of the estate. It is what we call the inheritance that Avram will bequeath this burial plot to the next generation. Why is that important? And the answer, I believe, lies in the comparison and the contrast between two phrases that sound almost identical. One phrase is called a stay makna. And if you learn the sugi at the beginning of Kiddushin, you'll see that we derive many halachas about kinyanim from the stay mikna in the kinyan, the acquisition of Avram of Kiryas Arba. But there's another phrase, achuzas koven. What is the difference between a stay mikna and a stay achuza? When one buys a piece of property, he can easily sell it. There is no permanent attachment to a piece of real estate. In fact, as you and I know, people make their living from buying and selling real estate. And usually they get a profit for it. Is there any emotional attachment to an apartment? Well, in a marriage, you'll find that often one partner or the other is more nostalgic and attached to an apartment. It's going to be hard to sell it. But there's another concept called stei achuza, miloshen achiza. A stei achuza is not just a financial arrangement. When Avram purchases this property, don't fool yourself into thinking, don't make the mistake that it's a stei mikna. Oh no, it's a stei achuza. A stei achuza is an emotional attachment to a piece of property, to a piece of land. I would say that emotionally, one is bound inwardly in the pnimius of his nefesh to a stei achuza. I have a field that will be passed down from one generation to the other, from father to son, from grandfather to grandson. And I will never give up my possession over a stei achuza. A stei mikna, as we said, comes and goes. Just have to watch out for taxes. When Avram pays the money, this is not just an acquisition of legal rights that it's now registered in the municipality. It's not just a superficial legal transaction of buying that could be sold, but rather it's a brand new relationship. Chazal tell us, Vayokom Asada, the double language. We already had Vayokom Asada. It means, Rashi quotes it, Tkuma Haisalo. The Karka, the Sada, had a Tkuma. It was uplifted. We don't understand the metaphysics of a physical object, a material carbon of earth, that it could be uplifted, Tkuma Haisalo. But that's a stei achuza. It goes way beyond a formal juridic ownership. Sara is buried in Maras HaMachpelah. Avram acquires not just the field in which he's buried, he acquires all of Eretz Canaan through the Sada, through the stei achuza. And the Ramban writes here that this process of Avram purchasing a stei achuza in Kiryas Arba initiates the entire fulfillment of the divine promise to Avram Avinu that the land belongs to him. And that's why the Torah emphasizes me'es b'nei ches. He is now taking the land away from the b'nei ches. And it will forever be the possession of the people of Israel. We will never sever that bond. Forget about Uganda. This is the land. This is the land that has a tkuma. And it all starts in Kiryat Arba. And now we begin a whole new parsha here in Perek Chaf Dal. It's fascinating to me that Perek Chaf Dal, the Perek of Eliezer, some call it the parsha of Shidduchim, opens up with the following statement: Vashem berech es Avram bakol. And the Lord blessed Abraham with everything. We're talking about Avram in his old age, Avram Zaken Babayom. What is the word bakol? What does it mean? On one level, you could talk about possessions and wealth. You could talk about Avram's influence. He was considered, the great. What do they call him over there? The sea. What does he say to him? Where's the pasuk? Can somebody help me here? Okay, I'm not finding it right now. Sorry. I don't want to waste too much time looking for it. I was hoping you would help me out with this, as I always do. Again, all I see here, I see Larry.
Eric 6.
Sorry, it's Pasuk Vav.
Pasuk Vav, thank you so much. Okay. It's
It's
good to know that there are actually human beings behind these names.
Oh, yes.
I used to be the only one, and so I let the men take over.
Oh, all right. Nisi Elokim atah b'sofim. However, what does it mean bakol on a spiritual level, on a more profound level of pnimius haTorah, of the deeper insights into the Torah? Avram Avinu bakol personifies the attributes that will create the 12 tribes of Israel. Bakol. He's got it all. He's got chesed. He's got gvura. As we said before, he's going to fight the battles. And the bakol indicates a very fantastic idea that you can have two attributes that seem to be mutually exclusive. They are diametrically opposed one to the other, and yet in the personality of Avram, reaching, as it were, the epitome of his life in Zikna, he would integrate and synthesize all these attributes that seem to be mutually exclusive. And by doing so, he allows his descendants, each one, to focus and to imbibe and to internalize a particular midah. The individual attributes will be divided up by the Bnei Yaakov. Yaakov, in the brachos at the end of Vayechi, will reveal how each particular shevet personifies its own midah. But it all begins with Avram. Hashem berech es Avram bakol. All these individual attributes of the 12 tribes really find their roots in the magnificent and multifaceted personality of Avram Avinu. He would pass on an inheritance to his descendants of a great, beautiful integration, many colors and many hues, many attributes that would be elevated by Yitzchak and by Yaakov, and then finally by the 12 Shvatim. The Ramban says that the word kol is a shortened form of the word kala, kala with a chaf, obviously, a bride. Knesset Yisrael, the people of Israel, are always compared to a bride. And when you take a look at a bride, as I did tonight, I'm coming straight from a wedding, you dance in front of a bride and you're meant to be Mesamech the Kala and mention her beautiful traits, Kala Nava Chasuda. And what does this concept of a Kala represent? Why is Knesset Yisrael throughout Shir Hashirim and elsewhere compared to a Kala? Because the Kala is an integration of so many different dimensions, so many different personality traits and attributes, all in one. And often these traits seem contradictory. Esses Yisrael is kinus. Kinus means to gather together, to assemble, to integrate. And in our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we, the people of Israel, are called the Kala. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is metaphorically called the Dod, the lover, and we are the beloved Kala. And the Ramban indicates that it all begins with Avram, Hashem Birech es Avram Bakol. Avram represents a metaphysical entity that's elevated through Emunah and through the integration of all these colors and personality traits. And that's what Knesset Yisrael, the Kala, is all about. In this parsha, we learn about Eliezer. Give me a second here to find the pasuk I'm looking. I would like to point out, and I see we're running low on time, but we'll try to at least wrap things up a little bit. In this Perek of Daled, in Pasuk Lamed Daled, Eliezer introduces himself to the family of Rivka. A very short pasuk. Vayomar Eved Avram Anochi. In the English, I am Abraham's servant. Eved Avram. I was wondering about the language here. Eved Avram. He could have said Eved Li Avram. And we'll see other psukim in Tanakh. What does it mean, Eved Avram? And he adds the word Anochi. You know, often you could talk about a servant who has a mind of his own. He likes to do his own thing. But Eliezer identifies himself as Eved Avram. Who am I? Identify yourself. I am an Eved Avram. Not that I'm a servant too, but this is my very essence. If he would have just said Eved li Avram, it means that Avram is my master and he bought me in a slave trade and he owns me juridically and he could sell me. But that's not what Eliezer is saying. He identifies his entire essence, his whole personality with Avraham Avinu. On the night of Pesach, we say, Avodim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim. We were Avodim leparo. We don't identify ourselves as Avodim of Paro. We were owned by Paro in a juridic sense. But on the night of Pesach, we declare that we are Avdei Hashem, our very essence. Our very personality is identified as an Eved Hashem. And perhaps this could shed a light on a certain woman who is mentioned. Vayishalchu es Rivka achosam ve'es me nikta. They send Rivka with me nikta. I mean, that indicates how young she was. Now, later on, in Perek Lamed Hey, let me just turn to Lamed Hey. Atamas Dvorah, Meinekes Rivka, Vatikover mitachas lebeis el tachas alon vayikra shmo alon b'chus. The Torah makes a big deal about the death of Dvorah Meinekes Rivka. By the way, the Torah tells us nothing about the death of Rivka herself. Only tells us about the death of Meinekes, who is indicated here. She's the one who takes Rivka to Yitzchak. Why the big deal? Alon b'chus. B'chus means crying and mourning. No record of the deaths of Rivka, no Leah for that matter. We have a story about Rachel. But I think tonight we should dedicate this shir to Dvorah. Because who is Dvorah? The Torah calls her Meinekes. But obviously she played a greater role than just Meinekes, because otherwise we wouldn't be mourning tragically her death. And the Torah wouldn't have been making such a big deal about her death, leaving out the death of Rivka and Leah. And the answer, I believe, is that on a deeper level, Meinekes, in this context, means that she raised Rivka. And why is that so critical? Rivka lives in a society of idol worshippers. The morality of HaRav in that time was that of idolatry. And yet, who is Rivka? The mother of Klal Yisrael. And what does the Torah tell us about this young girl, Rivka? Again, we always focus on the fact that Gam Ligmalech, she gives water to the Gmalech. But take a look, and with this we'll wrap it up for tonight. In Pasuk Chav Beis here in Perek Chav Daled, not only Gam Ligmalech Eshker, but it says Vayihi Kasher Kilu Hagmalim Lishtos, Vayikacha Ish Nezem Zahav Beka Mishkalo. Now it came about that when the camels had finished drinking, the man, meaning Eliezer, took a golden nose ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for our hands weighing 10 gold shekels. Why does the Torah go into such detail about the gifts that Eliezer transmits to little Rivka? And Rashi comments, it's also in the Targum Nonas and Uziel, that when the Pasuk says that it was a half a shekel, this is a remez to the Machzis HaShekel that would be paid by each head of Klal Yisrael. I can understand when it says here, Shnei Tzmidim, 2 bracelets, Chazal tell us that this is an allusion to the 10 Commandments, to the 2 Luchos Habris. When it says the 10 shekels, it's a hint to the 10 Commandments. Chazal want to connect Eliezer and his decision to choose Rivka as the marriage partner appropriate for Yitzchak based on the fact of the giving of the Torah. He knew, Eliezer, of the tremendous significance of choosing a wife for Yitzchak. She represents the future of Beis Avram, of the household of Avram. She will stand side by side with Yitzchak as Sara did to Avram in order to fulfill the mission of the covenantal community. And the Zera of Yitzchak, the Zera of Avram would come through this woman. So for sure, he wants to choose a woman who would be worthy for the Kabbalah of the Aseret Dibros, the divine revelation at Har Sinai, the giving of the Torah, to produce a Mamleches Kohanim and Goy Kadosh. But why did Chazal introduce the Machzis HaShekel, which was a method by which we counted the population, we took the census of Klal Yisrael in the Midbar? How does that represent a mitzvah that alludes to the entire future of Knesset Yisrael? And the answer is that the Torah describes Machzis HaShekel later on in Sefer Shmos, Perek Lamed, as the pidyon, as the ransom for the soul of Israel. When a person is guilty, and everyone is guilty, no one is perfect, Ein Tzaddik Ba'aretz. And a person realizes that he doesn't always stand up to the level that he's meant to reach to the pinnacle that he can attain and his potential. A person is great in Torah, but he should never forget that there's got to be humility. And certainly a wise man has to realize that he has to learn from others. Rivka is involved in the mitzvah of Hachnasas Orchim. What is the essence of Hachnasas Orchim? For sure, it's goodness, benevolence, and chesed, but it's much more than that. In Hachnasas Orchim, I invite people of different walks of life, different age brackets. Each one brings to the table his own experiences, his own wisdom, and his insight. And it's the Machzis HaShekel. The Torah says that every single Jew will contribute to Machzis HaShekel. Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem, from the greatest scholars to the wood choppers and the water drawers, the water carriers. Halomei mikol adam. When I invite people to my house, the mitzvah Hachnasas Orchim manifests my eagerness to hear, to exchange ideas. I want to learn from your experiences. Share with me. Reveal some insights from your life. That's the Machzis HaShekel. A person who thinks he's a great scholar and he's achieved such righteousness, such a person does not participate in the Machzis HaShekel. And she says to Eliezer, who asks her, is there a place for us for lodging in your father's house? Yes, there's a room in my father's house for you. Who are you? You are the messenger of Avram Avinu. There's a certain mystique about Avram Avinu. We haven't seen him for many, many decades. And we hear that he has a new morality, a new idea of where man can go and where man can achieve and where man can believe. And Rivka says, I'm very eager to hear about this. I have a tremendous desire and a thirst to soak up whatever you can teach me. She's not proud. She could have been proud. She came from an aristocratic family in Haran. But she wants to give her ear to this, pardon the expression, Mishulach, that comes from Eretz Canaan. Yes, there is a place for you to lodge for many nights. Eliezer, I want you to join us. I will sit up with you all night. Listen to the stories about this mysterious personality of Avram who's left us so many years ago. Eliezer, I need the pidyon of Machzis HaShekel to redeem my soul. I'm ready to learn. I'm eager to soak it up. And that's when Eliezer realized this is the woman who is suitable to be the marriage partner of Yitzchak, to be the mother of Klal Yisrael, of Knesset Yisrael. And that half a shekel represents the humility of a Jew to be ready to be the eternal student. Who is a Talmid Chacham? He's a Talmud. And then he's a Chacham. And who is the one who trains and raises this young girl named Rivka to greatness? It's none other than the Meinekes Dvorah. And therefore we mourn her loss. We don't know much about her as an individual, as a personality, but we realize that she was fighting against all the negative influences of a base love and of a base Besuel to train and raise a young girl named Rivka to be ready to embrace the entire tradition of the covenantal community, to play her part and her role, to be a marriage partner for Yitzchak. Iratam his will. That we learn from these great lessons of the Akedah, and we see Switzerland and we don't complain. We see an Avram Avinu who integrates so many different opposing attributes to make up the kol, the totality, the integration, the synthesis that will be the production that will generate Knesset Yisrael. We see the greatness of Yitzchak. After the Akedah, he goes on his own way to develop his attributes that will be passed on to the next generation. We see the formation of Knesset Yisrael, the covenantal community, through personalities like Avram, Yitzchak, Sara. And in the next generation, Rivka entering into the family, until finally, Amir Hashem, we have Yaakov, we have Rachel, we have Leah, and the 12 tribes of Israel. We be zocheh to be inspired by the study of Torah, to emulate the Avos and Imos, Kain Yiratzon. Amen. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for joining me and wish you a Parshas Chayei Sara Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.
יישר כוח, יישר כוח, good Shabbos.